The red earth of Burkina Faso stretched endlessly beneath the scorching sun, its surface cracked like the weathered palms of the elders who had worked this land for generations. Amadou Traoré stood at the edge of what would soon become the most ambitious railway project in Africa's history, his calloused hands gripping the surveyor's map that would reshape his nation's destiny. Barka de Zouwa, welcome to the future, he whispered in Moor, the ancient language of his ancestors, though the words felt foreign on his tongue. Around him, the sacred baobab trees stood like silent sentinels, their massive trunks bearing witness to centuries of his people's struggles and triumphs. The morning air carried the scent of millet and shea butter from the nearby village of Silmiogu, where his grandmother's spirit still danced in the cooking fires. But today, it also carried the metallic tang of machinery and the bitter dust of progress that would soon transform this ancestral land into a network of steel and concrete. "Papa Amadou," called his assistant Fatima, her voice cutting through the harmony of cicadas and distant drums. She approached with the confidence of the new generation, educated in Ouagadougou, fluent in French, English and 3 local languages, her bright head wrap a defiant splash of color against the corporate uniformity of the construction site. "The Chinese engineers have arrived," she announced, her tone carrying an undertone that spoke of centuries of foreign intervention. "They're asking about the compensation for the displaced families." Amadou's jaw tightened. The weight of leadership pressed heavy on his shoulders like the iron yoke his grandfather had described from the colonial days. As the project director appointed by President Traoré's government, he carried the hopes of 30 million Burkinabe and the scrutiny of international investors who saw only profit margins where he saw the sacred ground of his ancestors. The railway would stretch from Ouagadougou to the port of Tema in Ghana, cutting through the heart of West Africa like a lifeline. It promised to connect landlocked Burkina Faso to the Atlantic Ocean, reducing transportation costs by 60% and creating thousands of jobs. But it would also displace entire communities, including the village where his own great-grandmother was buried beneath a centuries-old tamarind tree. "Tell them we discuss compensation when we discuss respect," Amadou replied, his voice carrying the rhythmic cadence of the traditional griots who had taught him that words were weapons more powerful than any machine. "This is not just land. This is the repository of our ancestors' dreams." Fatima nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. She had grown up listening to the same stories, the same songs that spoke of a time when African hands shaped African destinies. But she also understood the harsh reality of economics in a globalized world where landlocked nations remained prisoners of geography unless they could forge new paths to prosperity. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the delegation of Chinese engineers, their hard hats gleaming white against the russet landscape. Leading them was Wei Chen, a man whose efficiency was legendary but whose understanding of African cultural nuances was as shallow as the dry season streams. "Mr. Traoré," Wei Chen began, his English precise but lacking the warmth that African conversations demanded. "We need to finalize the construction timeline. The Beijing headquarters expects the first phase to be completed within 18 months. Amadou studied the man's face, seeing in it the same impatience that had characterized decades of development projects that enriched foreign contractors while leaving local communities to shoulder the social costs. The irony was not lost on him. China, once colonized itself, now wields economic influence across Africa with the same paternalistic attitudes that had once oppressed his own people. "Lafi Bala, there is no peace without justice," Amadou responded, mixing English with more deliberately. "Before we lay the first rail, we must ensure that those who sacrifice their land for this project share in its benefits." The tension in the air was palpable, like the electric charge before the seasonal rains. Fatima translated for the local chiefs who had gathered, their presence a reminder that this project existed at the intersection of traditional authority and modern governance. Chief Naba Kum, whose family had ruled this region for 12 generations, stepped forward. His royal robes rustled in the desert wind as he spoke in the ancient tongue of his people. "Tan Sin Bti and Divine Tan Sin Bti Tenga, the work that we do today will determine the land that we leave for our children." The weight of his words settled over the gathering like dust after a sandstorm. Here was the voice of deep time, of continuity that spanned centuries, challenging the urgency of quarterly profit reports and international loan agreements. Wei Chen's translator struggled to convey the chief's meaning, but Amadou understood that some truths transcended language. This was about more than steel and concrete. It was about the soul of a nation choosing its own path forward. As the morning progressed, the complexity of the project became clear. The railway would traverse not just physical geography but cultural territories that had been defined by centuries of tradition, conflict, and survival. Each village along the proposed route had its own sacred sites, its own stories of resistance and resilience that could not be reduced to line items in a budget. "Tell me about the compensation package," Amadou said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to navigate between worlds. "How do you compensate someone for the loss of their ancestral burial ground? How do you put a price on the tree under which their great-grandfather made peace with neighboring tribes?" Wei Qin consulted his tablet, scrolling through data that reduced human displacement to statistical abstractions. The standard relocation package includes housing allowances, job training programs, and cash compensation based on current land valuations. "And who determines these valuations?" Fatima interjected, her voice sharp with the edge of someone who had seen too many development projects that promised prosperity but delivered poverty. "International assessment firms," Wei Qin replied, seemingly oblivious to the historical irony of his statement. Chief Naba Kum laughed, a sound that carried both mirth and sadness. "Tan Sin Kobi Mami Ti Ya, they want to weigh our hearts with their scales." The afternoon brought no resolution, only a deeper understanding of the chasm between progress and preservation. As the engineers retreated to their air-conditioned trailers, Amadou walked alone among the baobab trees, their ancient presence offering solace and guidance. His phone rang, a call from President Traoré himself. The voice on the other end carried the weight of a nation's expectations and the pressure of international debt obligations. "Amadou, my brother," the president began, using the informal tone that acknowledged their shared history as young revolutionaries who had dreamed of an Africa free from external control. "The World Bank is asking for progress reports. The Chinese are threatening to pull funding if we don't meet their timeline. What do you need from me?" Amadou stared at the horizon, where the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of the colors in his grandmother's most precious cloth. "I need time, Excellence. And I need the authority to negotiate terms that honor both our future and our past." "Time is a luxury we cannot afford," the president replied, his voice heavy with the burden of leadership. "The drought in the north has left millions dependent on food aid. The gold mines are facing international sanctions. This railway represents our best hope for economic transformation." That evening, Amadou convened a meeting under the stars, following the ancient tradition of community dialogue that had guided his people through centuries of challenges. The fire crackled in the center of the circle, its light dancing across the faces of villagers, engineers, government officials, and traditional leaders. Old Mamadou, the village griot, began with a story that had been passed down through generations. "Ti Yagong, Ti de Kodsnk. When the waters are troubled, we must remember the source of the stream." His words carried the rhythm of oral tradition, each syllable weighted with the wisdom of ancestors who had navigated previous upheavals. He spoke of the Great Drought of 1973, when the railway built by the French colonial administration had brought relief supplies but also accelerated the migration of young people to distant cities. He told of the independence struggles, when infrastructure projects became symbols of both liberation and new forms of dependence. "Every generation faces the choice," the griot continued, his voice weaving through the night air like smoke from the sacred fire. "Do we build for today's hunger or tomorrow's freedom? Do we accept the help of strangers or find strength in our own hands?" Fatima translated for the Chinese engineers, who listened with the polite attention of people fulfilling a cultural obligation rather than seeking understanding. But Amadou saw something shift in Wei Chen's expression, a flicker of recognition that perhaps spoke to his own country's long history of balancing tradition with modernization. "In my village in Sichuan," Wei Chen said slowly, "we have a saying, Qian li jixing shiyu zhu xia, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. But we also know that the direction of that first step determines the entire journey." It was the first time the engineer had spoken of his own cultural background, and the acknowledgement created a small bridge across the vast divide of understanding. The night deepened, and with it came the voices of young people who saw the railway as their pathway to opportunities that had been denied to their parents. Salim Atta, a recent university graduate, stood to speak with the confidence of someone who had spent her childhood listening to the dreams of her elders and her adulthood studying the realities of global economics. "Ti legya ti de tar ti ma'am, we cannot remain where we are if we want to reach our destination," she said, her words carrying the urgency of a generation that refused to accept the limitations imposed by geography and history. But her grandmother, Aissata, rose with the deliberate grace of someone who had survived famines, coups, and the slow erosion of traditional ways of life. "Timane ti sablim nkete, we must not lose ourselves in the pursuit of what we think we want." The debate continued through the night, each voice adding to a complex harmony that reflected the full spectrum of perspectives within the community. Young people spoke of opportunities in modern logistics and engineering. Elders warned of the social costs of rapid change. Women's groups discussed the potential for new markets for their agricultural products. Traditional authorities emphasized the need to maintain cultural continuity. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of hope and possibility, Amadou felt the weight of synthesis settling upon him like a mantle of responsibility. The railway would be built, the economic imperatives were too strong to resist. But it would be built in a way that honored the deepest values of his people. Tida Kodsnj. We will honor the source, he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had found his path through the maze of competing interests and pressures. The compensation package would include not just financial payments but cultural preservation funds that would support the documentation of oral histories, the maintenance of sacred sites, and the establishment of cultural centers along the railway route. Local communities would receive shares in the railway's revenue, ensuring that prosperity would flow back to the land that made it possible. Construction jobs would be reserved for local workers, with comprehensive training programs that would transfer technical skills to the next generation. Environmental impact assessments would be conducted in partnership with traditional ecological knowledge holders, ensuring that the railway enhanced rather than destroyed the natural systems that sustained local communities. Most importantly, the project would proceed at a pace that allowed for genuine consultation and adaptation. The Chinese investors would need to accept extended timelines in exchange for the social license that would ensure the project's long-term success. And if they refuse? Fatima asked, her practical mind already calculating the political and economic consequences of such demands. Amadou looked toward the horizon, where the first light of day was revealing the vast expanse of land that would soon be transformed by ribbons of steel and concrete. Then we will find other partners. Africa is no longer a continent of limited options. The truth of his statement was evident in the changing dynamics of global development. Chinese investment had been crucial in financing infrastructure projects across Africa, but it was no longer the only game in town. Turkish, Indian, and Brazilian companies were competing for contracts, while African development banks were gaining the capacity to finance major projects with less external dependency. Wei Chen listened to the translation of Amadou's conditions with the careful attention of someone recalculating complex equations. His phone buzzed with messages from Beijing, each one carrying the pressure of shareholders and political overseers who measured success in terms of speed and profit margins. I will need to consult with my headquarters, he said finally, his tone suggesting that the negotiations had entered a new phase of complexity and possibility. As the sun rose fully, casting long shadows across the landscape, the gathered crowd began to disperse. The Chinese engineers retreated to their trailers to begin the delicate process of renegotiating terms with distant decision-makers. The villagers returned to their daily routines, carrying with them the knowledge that their voices had been heard and their concerns acknowledged. Chief Naba Kum approached Amadou as the others departed, his weathered face creased with the satisfaction of someone who had seen wisdom prevail over expedience. Tida Bs Yatsnj. We have honored our ancestors today, he said, placing a hand on Amadou's shoulder in a gesture that transferred the blessing of generations to the challenges ahead. The weeks that followed were a complex dance of negotiation, compromise, and creative problem-solving. Beijing's initial response was predictably negative. The revised terms would increase costs and extend timelines beyond acceptable parameters. But Amadou had anticipated this reaction and had already begun developing alternative strategies. The African Development Bank expressed interest in co-financing the project under the revised terms, recognizing that the cultural preservation and community benefit clauses aligned with their mandate for sustainable development. The European Union, eager to counter Chinese influence in West Africa, offered technical assistance and environmental impact funding. Most significantly, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, endorsed the project as a model for infrastructure development that respected both economic efficiency and cultural sovereignty. The endorsement carried weight not just in financing circles but in the court of African public opinion, where the railway was increasingly seen as a symbol of the continent's ability to shape its own development agenda. Fatima emerged as a crucial figure in these negotiations, her fluency in multiple languages and her understanding of both traditional and modern governance structures making her an ideal bridge between different worlds. She spent her days translating not just words but entire worldviews, helping Chinese engineers understand the spiritual significance of sacred groves and teaching village elders about the technical requirements of modern railway construction. The breakthrough came when Wei Chen returned from Beijing with a revised proposal that incorporated many of Amadou's conditions. The Chinese government, facing increasing international scrutiny over its development practices in Africa, had decided that the Burkina Faso project would serve as a showcase for culturally sensitive infrastructure development. Yabi T de Kodsnj. The waters have found their proper course, Chief Naba Kum observed as the revised agreements were signed in a ceremony that blended traditional blessing rituals with modern contract formalities. The first phase of construction began 6 months later than originally planned, but with a level of community support that surpassed any previous development project in the region. Local youth found employment not just as laborers but as cultural liaisons, environmental monitors and community development coordinators. Traditional craftsmen were contracted to create artistic elements that would celebrate the region's heritage at railway stations and major junctions. The railway's route was adjusted to avoid the most sacred sites, adding some construction complexity but preserving the spiritual geography that gave meaning to the landscape. Where adjustment was impossible, elaborate ceremonies were conducted to properly honor the ancestors and ensure their blessing for the project. As the first rails were laid, Amadou stood once again beneath the baobab trees, but now he was not alone. Fatima stood beside him, her notebook filled with documentation of the project's social and cultural impacts. Weichin was there too, his hard hat now adorned with a small traditional amulet that Chief Naba Kum had given him as a symbol of protection and welcome. Tida Tarti ma'am, we have reached our destination, Amadou said, though he knew that the true destination was not a place but a way of being that honored both progress and tradition. The railway would take 5 years to complete, connecting Burkina Faso to the global economy while preserving the cultural foundations that made that connection meaningful. It would carry gold and cotton to international markets, but it would also carry the dreams and aspirations of a people who had learned to navigate modernity without losing their souls. In the evenings, as the construction crews returned to their camps, the sound of traditional drums would mingle with the mechanical rhythms of progress. Children would gather around the elders to hear stories of the ancestors, while also learning about the engineering marvels that were transforming their landscape. The railway was more than infrastructure. It was a declaration of independence from the false choice between tradition and modernity. It proved that African solutions to African challenges could accommodate both the wisdom of centuries and the requirements of the global economy. As the sun set on another day of construction, painting the sky in the eternal colors of hope and possibility, Amadou felt the presence of his ancestors in the evening breeze. They were not disapproving ghosts haunting the present but active participants in the ongoing story of their people's journey toward prosperity and dignity. The railway would carry more than cargo. It would carry the dreams of a continent learning to build its own bridges between past and future, between the sacred and the practical, between the local and the global. In the rhythm of steel on steel, future travelers would hear the ancient heartbeat of Africa, steady and strong, carrying its people forward into a destiny of their own making. When in Nayaki Twvsk, God will guide us on our journey, Chief Naba Kum said as the stars appeared in the darkening sky, and in those words lay the blessing of generations for the path they had chosen to walk together. The railway would be built, but it would be built with the blessing of the ancestors, the participation of the people, and the vision of a future that honored both the sacred ground of the past and the infinite possibilities of tomorrow. In the end, it was not just about connecting places but about connecting hearts, minds and souls in the shared journey of human progress guided by the enduring wisdom of those who had walked the path before.